Nau mai, hara mai, good day and welcome everyone. My name is Craig Bleakley and I'm the Safety Risk Consultant here at EcoPortal. Pleasure to have your company again. We firmly believe that we all win when we share and collaborate on what works for keeping people safe. So we regularly host these safety leaders and experts in an effort to share knowledge across the HSEQ and business communities. In today's session, we are so pleased to welcome Psychosocial Safety Solutions founder, Conor Duffy, to the virtual stage to share his tips on building a mental health strategy with us. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Conor Duffy. There he is there, what a beautiful man. Conor is a registered nurse with qualifications in health and safety and a master's in business administration. With over a decade of experience in health and safety and a background in physical and psychological rehabilitation, Conor has won a number of awards recognizing his achievements in the sector. In his previous role, Conor was head of health and safety for Kmart Australia and New Zealand, where he led the health and safety strategy. So now, with that great introduction and all that out of the way, I'm going to relinquish the virtual microphone. Conor, a virtual welcome, and over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks, Craig. Lovely introduction. And thank you all so much for making the time. And as Craig said, EcoPortal have invited me along today. So a massive thanks to them for inviting me and having me to talk about a topic that I'm super passionate about. So I'm going to talk to you today, hopefully, about some just real solid tips. I've been to a few presentations on psychosocial safety and mental health strategy building. And I often find that I said to Craig, it just feels like a bit of a sales pitch. So I'm adamant that I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to get on and hopefully give you some real life tips you can embed into your systems to create a mental health strategy that's really robust and really relevant for your organizations. So a little bit about me. I think the first thing to call out is I'm super passionate about diversity and inclusion, and I'm very aware that I'm fortunate to be presenting from Aboriginal land today. So I'm in Newcastle, New South Wales today. I'm normally based in Melbourne. So I want to call out that this whole country always has been and always will be Aboriginal land. And I and the broader team at Psychosocial Solutions acknowledge the connection to these lands, waterways and skies that Aboriginal people have held for time immemorial, and I pay my respects to their leaders. I also acknowledge now iwi Maori as the Tangata Whenua of Aotearoa, and we work to uphold the Treaty of Waitangi. So, beautiful countries. I spend a lot of time across Australia and New Zealand, and I'm very, very aware and conscious that I'm a visitor to these lands. A bit more about me. First thing you should know is I'm not a psychologist. As Craig said, I am a registered nurse by trade, and I've worked in psychiatric wards, I've worked in rehabilitation wards, I've worked in emergency wards and paediatric wards. I've had a fairly varied nursing career, albeit in a fairly short space of time before I moved into the corporate world. So across my time, particularly in psychiatric and rehabilitation wards, I really noticed the trend towards workplace illness and injuries, and decided to pick up a graduate certificate at uni in health and safety, and that really began my career. I've worked across a number of international organisations, both through a consultancy role and in my previous role as the head of health and safety for Kmart Australia and New Zealand. So I've had the benefit of sharing in the creation of a number of mental health strategies, but I certainly haven't done it alone. I've always had amazing expertise, some phenomenal organisational psychologists who've helped me throughout my career to better understand really how we can take my learnings from a rehabilitation ward and really build that into a causation and ultimately a control point of view. And here's my first disclosure of the day. I get really frustrated at some of the conversations and the discourse around mental health strategy building. There is multiple posts that I kind of roll my eyes at online on LinkedIn that are questioning, are we using the right language? Are we, building out something that's... So why did I start this company? Why did I start Psychosocial Solutions? Well, I had some really nice exposure to a number of industries and a number of as I said, clinical wards and clinical settings. So the ability to connect workplace and injury and illness, whether it was physical or psychological injury and illness, was something that was super passionate to me. But as Craig said, I actually did my MBA last year. I finished it in November. And something that I didn't expect from that is a really introspective look at myself to better understand my values, my purpose, and who I am and where I want to be. And I became a bit obsessed with a concept that I learned at uni called Ikigai, which some of you may be familiar with. This concept is a Japanese term for life's purpose. And it asks you four kind of key questions to consider, which are on the left-hand side of the screen. What do I love? What does the world need? What am I good at? And what can I be paid to do? And if you ultimately understand and you really delve into understanding your ikigai, ultimately what it can end up in is a bit of a term of endearment or a goal or a purpose for you to really strive towards. So for me, after a lot of soul searching, I found that mine was just two words. I like to think my purpose is to support. Now, that can be to support an individual who might be in crisis. It might be supporting a global organization with building out their safety or their psychosocial safety strategy, or it might be helping a friend move. Ultimately, they're the things that really give me purpose, give me drive, and ultimately make me happy. And so I highly recommend go away, try and do some research, have a look introspectively and figure out, what is your purpose and how do you best find that you can support others? The reason I give you that context is to tell you that it's not all about me, but I think it'll hopefully help paint the pictures. The reality is I'd say a number of you are here because this is a really, really hot topic. And I did some very quick Googling and it wasn't hard to come up with some pretty prominent headlines in relation to psychosocial safety. Unfortunately, we've had some really significant issues, particularly in Australia, where it comes to suicide and work potentially being a causal factor. And also, we have regulations rolling out across the country, and in New Zealand, it had certainly been flagged that this will happen. So I can see a great contingency from New Zealand, which I really appreciate you all joining. I think what we're seeing is New Zealand is really not far behind, and you will see, whilst mental health is already considered in the New Zealand legislation, that is only going to build out to be much, much further. And why you should care is because it's the right thing to do. That's the genuine nature of why I'm here to talk to you today. As I said, I'm a nurse by trade. I like to think my purpose is to support. If I'm doing my role well and I'm fulfilling my own purpose, then ultimately I'm going to make you think not just about the business factors, but the human factors behind having a really robust psychological safety strategy. So let's talk about some of the business factors. If we look beyond the legislation, you're in a leadership position. It's been proven that your sales, your culture, your retention, your absenteeism, your productivity rates, and everything else will improve if you get your psychosocial safety standards to a really, really strong sense that you have a flourishing team who feels super comfortable to be at work. And most importantly, they feel really comfortable to raise their hand and say, actually, I'm not comfortable with X, Y, Z, or I feel like this practice could be improved. I think that's when you know you're moving into a really safe climate and you've got a really strong culture where people are comfortable to talk about their mental health. And my catch cry on my website for the business is put the H back in WHS. And I think health and safety, we get a bad name sometimes. Sometimes we're the auditors, sometimes we're writing a policy, sometimes we're the people with the stick. Ultimately, I think we've all got into this field for the right reason. And if we put the health back in health and safety, or as someone corrected me, they said you should put the heart back into health and safety. And I think that is just the most amazing, ambitious goal that we could possibly have. We as an industry, and I'm talking to a lot of my peers on the call here, if we can change the narrative around health and safety, that we are good, we're good people and we're here for the right reasons, and ultimately we have the power to, yes, abide by legislation and make sure CEOs are staying out of jail, but ultimately we're improving your sales, your retention rates and reducing your absenteeism. Ultimately, we can make a huge, huge financial and human difference to our organizations. And as I say, more than anything, it's just the right thing to do. So as I said, I'm going to discuss all elements of mental health strategy building today. So apologies if many of you are familiar with this, but this is the mental health continuum. And you don't need to read all the dot points because I'll tell you my favorite analogy when it comes to understanding mental health. If you walk into an emergency room after you've had an injury, the first thing that the triage nurse who's working behind the glass will ask you is, can you rate your pain from 1 to 10? When you've described what's going on, they want to understand on a scale, how's your pain feeling? If I was to ask you, can you rate your mental health from 1 to 10, what would you say? Have a think about where you feel you fit on that continuum. If 10 is excelling and 1 is being in crisis, a lot of us, although we think we should be a 7, 8, 9, 10 all the time, the reality is we're sitting between about 3 and 6. That's really, really standard. Some of us are a bit meh. Some of us are on autopilot. It's those feelings when you drive to work and you go, geez, I don't even remember getting in the car. Sometimes we're just kind of getting through the day, and that's perfectly okay. I always challenge people who feel that they're not where they should be on the mental health continuum, that happiness is a joy that comes to visit. It's not a constant feeling. So don't put that pressure on yourself or on your workforce to think that they should be happy and flourishing all the time. We do want to help them to flourish. We want to help them to thrive. But if your mental health strategy is sound, I want you to consider every single element of the mental health continuum. How are you ensuring that those people that are thriving and excelling are going to continue to do so in the best possible environment? And in the same breath, if we look at people who are in crisis, struggling or unsettled, how does your mental health strategy help those individuals to flourish? So be really conscious when you're putting the work around your framework of your mental health strategy. I want you to consider all elements of that mental health continuum, of that 1 to 10. How are we helping those people who are in crisis? How are we helping the vast majority who are just kind of ticking along? And then how are we helping those really important people who are thriving and excelling at the top end? How do we make sure we keep them engaged and keep them within our business? I think it's really important, again, apologies if you're across the stress curve, but I think it's a really important piece to understand for those in operational roles. Stress is not a bad thing. Stress is actually a healthy thing if it's done right. I'm under stress right now. Firstly, I'm under gravitational stress, but emotionally I'm under stress because I'm in a new environment. I'm in New South Wales. I'm sitting in an office that I haven't sat in before. I'm hotspotting from my phone. I can see there's 231 people who are watching me. I'm conscious that I just had to cough. You know, all these things that weigh on your brain and constantly make you question yourself. Stress is good. It means I care. It means I want to perform. It means I hope that the 41 chats that I see are actually positive and not saying, geez, how boring is this guy? You know, these are the things that we really want to improve. Stress as a motivator. It makes me energized. That's where we want people stressed, because if I'm stressed in my role in a positive way, I'm engaged, I'm smashing out my work as best as I possibly can. I want my boss's role. So I'm really keen to kind of impress and take on further responsibilities. Stress can be a great motivator. It makes me want to pay my bills and pay my mortgage. It makes me want to be a good husband and a good dad. Stress makes me overthink at times, and that's okay, as long as it doesn't tip into the overload or the burnout and breakdown. So that's really important to understand. When we're shifting people in an unsafe psychological environment, if our mental health strategy isn't robust, we might be pushing people into the overload and burnout and kind of quadrants of this graph. So we need to be really conscious that that might happen from time to time, but when it becomes the norm, when it becomes a constant, you will lose people, either through physical, psychological illness, or potentially through other means like workers' compensation or through resignations. And we all know it is expensive to try and rehire people. So if you want to create a really flourishing, strong financial environment, the human element absolutely cannot be missed. And again, I talk about the financial piece, but remember, we're doing this because this is the right thing to do. Because being inactive and bored is just as dangerous from a retention piece as burnout and breakdown. And again, I'm sure we've all been at that quadrant at some point in our life where we just think, geez, I'm on autopilot. I'm not getting challenged at work. My boss doesn't really engage with me. If you're feeling like you're in that space, that's really dangerous, again, from a retention piece. And we see increased workers' compensation claims. We see huge amounts of turnover in organizations that maybe don't have the job demands that meet the job resources. And I'll talk a bit about that model shortly. So understanding psych hazards, these are usually arising from 4 categories. So it's the design or the management of work. It's the workplace interactions and behaviours that you see on site. It's plant at a workplace, or it's the work environment itself. Psychological hazards will generally come from one of these 4 quadrants. And ultimately what that results in is a stress response on the far end of the stress curve. So where we start to see people get burnt out. As I said, this can result in a couple of things. Firstly, psychological harm, but secondly, also physical harm. How often do we hear about CEOs or people in really high risk industries, high pressure environments that are actually suffering from heart illness, cardiovascular disease, musculoskeletal disorders? So psychological stress does have an impact, yes, on our psychological system, but on our physical system as well. So where to start? If you're on the journey, firstly, you're here. So that's a great start. So thank you for joining. You've shown a keen interest. But really what I want to talk about is, how do you build a strategy? How are you going to consult? It's all well and good for us in our head offices potentially, or as some people would put it, our ivory towers, to know or to think we know what's going on at a site in Dunedin, for example. The reality is you don't know unless you ask the question. So build out a really healthy conversation with your team members. And a great way to do this is through your committees. A lot of you will have workplace health and safety committees on your sites already. Are you asking anything from a psychosocial safety point of view within those questions? Do you have a culture survey? If you have a culture survey, that's great. But are you asking the right questions within that culture survey? Or are you using the data that you're getting to try and fill in some blanks, to give yourself some form of comfort? You need to challenge yourself, ask yourself, every instance of safety, how are you building psychological safety into that conversation? This is a big one. How will you consider your unknown unknowns? And what I mean by that is if you take yourself back to 2019, the reality is none of us saw the pandemic coming. But when you start to review the information online and through research now, the reality is it was foreseeable. It was something that could have been not prevented, but could have been and worked towards from an organizational point of view to really help with your psychological safety. In 3 years, we've completely flipped how people work, particularly those in corporate office settings. How are you going to consider the unknown unknowns that you might need your psychosocial safety strategy to really be robust? How will you make your mental health strategy recognizable? I think this is a huge one. Again, oftentimes I'll go into an organization and they say, we've got a brilliant mental health strategy. Everyone's happy, everything's great. And they've got a beautiful poster on the wall or on the safety notice board. And then as soon as you walk down and you speak to a casual who's been there for 6 months and say, oh, tell me about the mental health strategy, or tell me how this organization keeps you safe at work. Psych doesn't come into it, unfortunately. So how do you make it a recognizable brand? How do you sell it to the broader team, particularly those in medium and large organizations? It's so valuable to have a recognizable catchphrase or something that ties into your business. And my fourth point there is consider the values of your business. Which ones already cover safety, and how could they potentially be adapted to align to psychosocial safety? The systemic approach to preventing harm and supporting recovery when it comes to mental health has been developed by Kmart Australia, and that's the image you can see at the bottom there. So really what we propose is looking at prevention of harm, right? First and foremost, that's what we want to do. We want to prevent psychological illness and injury. And where it starts to raise, or where we start to see people who are struggling, how do we intervene early? That's something that you really need to be conscious of. I get frustrated in a physical safety sense because we've been talking about early intervention for 30 years, like it's still a brand new idea. But it probably is a newer idea when it comes to psychosocial safety on a broader scale. When I go out to organisations, I get told about this amazing early intervention and program that's in place that really helps with injured workers. But it very, very rarely includes psychological injuries and illness. So you need to be really mindful. What systems have you got in place to intervene early? Often the response I get to that question is, oh, we've got EAP. EAP is a fantastic tool, but it is not your mental health strategy. And I really need you to hear that. It's really important that your strategy, it's actually focused on work design, from stopping people from struggling in the first place. But if and when something happens in work or outside of work, do you have the mechanisms in place to support that individual? And particularly what I'd suggest is for those large organizations, considering the direct line manager, what have we done to upskill that individual to help them to intervene early? I'm going to talk about psychological first aid shortly. As I say, once we've intervened, people will often need an extended period of time to really recover. So how are we going to support that recovery? And we really could treat it just like a physical injury. We make accommodations if someone has a physical injury to support their return to work and their duties. Are you willing to do the same thing from an operational and organizational point of view to support that recovery, to get that person back to a flourishing state? Every psychologist in the world, I think, will agree that being at work is really important for us. It gives us routine. It gives us really, really positive interactions and communication and structure. It makes you get up. It makes you shower. It makes you get dressed. It makes you talk to people around the water cooler and have a social lunch. But the thing we need to remember is it needs to be a really safe environment that they're walking into. So again, we've circled back to the prevention of harm, and there's some points in the middle there. Consider your work design. Is it a really positive work design, and does it consider job demands versus job resources? How do you monitor and review your strategy? How do you train, inform, and supervise those people who are in key leadership positions and the team members as well to make sure everyone is contributing to a psychologically safe environment? Leadership and management commitment is so vital, and the best organizations that do this well have a CEO at the front or an MD at the front who are talking about it. And to the CEOs on the call today or watching the recording, I have one main request of you, which is just be empathetic. I think sometimes you can be seen as absolutely bulletproof and you know, nothing affects you. And the reality is we know that's not the case. So I really encourage those in leadership positions, don't be afraid to show a bit of yourself. People really respond to it. They start to trust in you that you're willing to talk about mental health. So maybe if I'm struggling one day, I can talk about it as well. And then consultation, that's my 3 C's of safety is consultation, consultation, consultation. At Safe Work Australia, it says consult, cooperate, and coordinate. But consultation is just so vital when it comes to building a really sound mental health strategy. And you can see at the bottom of that model, promoting general health and wellbeing is so vital. Strong body, strong mind. We really want to make sure we're looking at health holistically. And again, putting the H back in WHS. So again, when you're getting started, it's really vital to understand your baseline and even to consider, how do you understand your baseline? And I'll give you some tips. There's a cheat sheet coming up, but I want you to understand, what do you know and what do you not know, really importantly. So an external review is a really good place to start. There is many companies out there who are really well equipped to support your mental health strategy build, but I would just really recommend, do your research. Make sure you're going with someone who's reputable, who has a strong understanding, and if possible, try and get someone who has some organizational psychology information as well. Resources available. And if your budget doesn't allow it, there's so many free tools that are available online. And I've taken a photo of one of the better ones, which is the People at Work survey. So it is an Australian psychosocial risk assessment survey, but it's also available in New Zealand. So to those on the call from New Zealand, you can absolutely access this as well. And just remember, there's a lot of safety professionals on the call. You don't need to be a psychologist to understand risk. You do this day in, day out as you're completing a risk assessment. You just need to potentially broaden your tools to make sure you're considering psychosocial risk when you're conducting those workplace inspections or your risk assessments. And again, if you can get access to an organizational psychologist, I've throughout my career worked with some incredible ones who have just educated me so well, and I've found huge benefit in it. And I think that's really important. This is a changing landscape. No one has, the perfect expertise. So try and build an environment where you can reach out to others, and reach out to me if you want to ask a question. And because I love kind of bouncing ideas off others and getting the best possible outcome for Australians and New Zealanders across the country. It doesn't matter whether it's work-related or not. So some questions I want you to consider in your safety sense. Have you got a risk register? And if you do, that's great. But I find it very, very rare that I log on and look at someone's risk register and there is a psychosocial risk listed. So really consider, are you actually considering the hours that your staff are working? Are you considering things like occupational violence? Are you considering things about how you're providing resources or potentially not providing the best possible resources to your team members? If I think about it from a supply chain or a distribution center point of view, or a warehouse, if you've got a forklift and the forklift hasn't been serviced in years and the wheels look tired and the keys are always left in there because no one actually really cares about it, have you considered the psychological impact of that, as well as the severe safety risks that are potentially causing physical injuries as well? Does your risk assessment tool consider psychosocial risks? Does your inspection template consider psychosocial risks? If not, really, really easy additions, a couple of questions in there that will show you're on a bit of a maturity journey. And what I really like to do, and I've seen great benefit from, is having honest conversations from a leadership perspective with those on the front line. So it can be you going up to a casual who only works a couple of times a week and just saying, hey, is there anything you're concerned about? And they'll usually say, oh, I'm not too comfortable with how my shifts are being laid out. That's something that we can work towards to creating a flourishing team member environment. What are your goals? How are you going to, get there, and how are you going to measure that you've actually succeeded? And how do you measure where you're at? Do you have a baseline? And if not, take a screenshot here, because I'm hoping some of these questions will help answer. What questions are in your culture survey, if you have one? And this is a controversial one, because culture surveys do not answer your psychosocial safety status. They don't tell you if you have a flourishing environment, but they will give you a snapshot. And if you have the right questions in there, you can definitely add some context to the psychosocial safety environment that you're working in. What wellbeing support do you provide employees, if any? And most importantly, do they even know about it? Or is it a poster that you've walked by 100 times? And I walked into a fairly large organization who had beautiful EAP posters up on every safety notice board, except they had changed providers 6 years before, and they were very, very old posters that just kept getting reprinted. So, if someone was calling that number, unfortunately, there might not have been someone picking up the phone on the other end. Really, really valuable to make sure that your team members are aware of the wellbeing offerings that you've got in place. What psych-related incidents have you had in the last few years? And do you have any claims? Have you had many in the last 3 years? And what do those claims look like? What's the profile? What's the length? What's the common causation? Do HR and health and safety share complaints or concerns relating to bullying, harassment, and overload? As I said, do you offer an EAP service? What's your utilization? How does that compare to others in the industry? We often see that in hospitality, the utilization is really low. In healthcare, it's relatively high. So you've got to make sure you're comparing apples with apples. Are you sitting at a rough estimate of where you should be? And a question I always like to look at, because people say, oh, our EAP uptake is 2%. It's great. It's well above average. That might be ideal, but if 1.9 of that 2% is relating to work concerns, then you have a workplace psychosocial safety issue. People aren't just calling for their personal concerns, they're calling because of work. So we need to be really mindful of that. And then the final question about EAP is, does it even matter? because you might have an uptake of 0.001%, and maybe that means that you have the best psychological safety environment on the planet. It doesn't always tell the full story. Similar with the culture survey, you've got to take this information and build it into a full tell. So then what? You've got your baseline, hopefully. What are you going to do about it? As I said, consult, and then control. It's really important that the team members are seeing some turnaround and actually seeing that you've identified the risk and then you're starting to control it. So the job demands resources model I spoke about is on the right there. I want you to focus on the top right-hand quadrant. That's where we have high resources, so that the ability to do the role that you've been hired to do with high demands. And ultimately that results in average strain and high motivation. Same on the left, we see low demands, but high resources. You're getting that high motivation, but we're on the lower strain. And consider the stress curve that we spoke about. We want people to feel that healthy level of stress, but we need to make sure we give them the job resources to do their role. It's all well and good to say, hey, go and work remotely. But if you're not providing a laptop that has decent Wi-Fi connectivity, then you're actually adding to your psychological strain of your workforce. Low job control is a really common risk that we see often. Low role clarity. So people go, oh yeah, look, Johnny did that for 10 years. We've got a new person, but he'll be right. That's really, really tough environment for someone to thrive in. They need to have understanding of their role, and they need to have some control over the activity that they're doing as well. And traumatic events, unfortunately, have risen significantly across all industries in the last 4 or 5 years. And what we're really seeing in the retail, hospitality, and healthcare environments is it's at an all-time high. So if you're working in those industries, aged care is a real call out at the moment. You need to consider how you're managing traumatic events and preventing them from occurring in the first place. And then harassment and bullying. I want you to think about how you define your risks. I've just given you 5 really common risks that we see often. What about your risks in your own industry? I mentioned occupational violence. And if you have a highly casualised workforce, so in hospitality and retail, there's usually uncertainty around job security. How are you managing that message? Manufacturing or operations and logistics, often shift work and fatigue that's contributing ultimately to an unsafe psychosocial environment. And then social work, it's the emotional drain, or even, psychologists that we meet with who have that constant hour after hour after hour interaction with people who might be struggling or might be in crisis. The emotional drain on those individuals is significant. So remember, some stress is good, but when it's tipping over into those high risk identification areas, we want to make sure you're putting in really strong controls. And on that, my message is don't complicate it. Sometimes I'll walk into organizations and I'll say, I don't know what to do. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist, so I can't really manage it. That is not the case. You're potentially a safety professional, you have safety professionals in your business, or you've worked on safety before and you've managed risks. If you can manage physical risks, the same principles apply to psychosocial risks. Have a think about what are the most effective controls, and it's always elimination or substitution, and then working all the way down to admin and PPE. Are there things that you can put in place to improve psychological safety? And the answer is yes. Don't overcomplicate this. Don't think you need a specific individual. There's plenty of research out there now that says safety professionals are best placed to manage psychosocial risks. What we often find is the safety professionals don't always feel super comfortable to take that work on. So it's important that we're providing them with the resources and training and comfort that they can then go and say, no, you know what? I have done risk control for years and years and years. This is just a different type of risk and I can learn. So incident response is something I'm talking about more and more, I dare say every day. And it's particularly relevant for those who are dealing with traumatic events in their workplace. And again, there's some unhelpful discourse out there around mental health first aid and psychological first aid. I'm a big believer in psychological first aid because the principles of psych first aid have been endorsed by the World Health Organization, particularly for those organizations that have lower budgets. They're really cheap to implement. And so it's a really nice way to improve your leadership capacity. So it's not debriefing, it's not obtaining details of trauma, it's not treating. That's a big one to call out because the last point is almost the most important. It's not something that you need to be a psychologist to do. You're not counseling, you're not diagnosing. You're actually intervening within an incident and then providing support and a response. It is something that anyone can do once they have the proper training to calm a person who might be in distress and ultimately lead them into that area of recovery. So what is psychological first aid? Well, this is taken straight from the Red Cross. It's 3 principles that really are focused on intervening in a moment and helping someone who's in crisis get out of crisis. So look, Now, how I describe that is it might be you noticing that your high performer who always has an iron shirt and has the perfect amount of perfume or aftershave and their hair is perfectly kept, all of a sudden isn't themselves. They look a little bit unkempt. They've started becoming late for meetings, late to work. They're turning the camera off on Zoom. All those things are starting to paint a picture that maybe they're not doing as well as they once were. And then I want you to consider the other end, which is asking, are you okay? Which some organizations are amazing at. Are you okay? And the person is saying, no, I'm not. You've looked, you've actually checked in on their safety. You're listening to the response, which is the second step, right? You're reacting to what they're saying and you're understanding and you're telling them first and foremost, hey, I'm really worried about you. I love you. I want to help you. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a doctor. But what I do know is I care about you. And at the moment, I need to get you some help. And that leads to the third principle of psychological first aid, which to me is the most important. And that is to link. Link, link, link. And what I mean by that is if you are not a psychologist, don't pretend to be one. I say this, and I'm a psychiatric nurse with some decent training behind me. And I've had many conversations with people who are expressing suicidal thoughts. And ultimately, I know my place is not to take on that person and their psychological health because it's outside of my scope. I need to get them someone who's better trained than me. So that might be me encouraging them to call an organisation like Lifeline or Mental Health New Zealand, or understanding that EAP has a crisis service available. But it's really up to me to link them in with an individual. It might be in the worst possible sense, or the most, heightened sense, helping that person to get emergency services support. But the key message here is you've done your job. You've looked out for them, you've listened to them, and if it's got to the point that they're in crisis and they need immediate help, you've linked them in with someone. Even if they're on the lower end and they just say, look, I've had a really tough few months and I'm just struggling with everything. That's why I'm not owning my shirt. That's why I'm turning my camera off. I'm going through a divorce. I'm having issues with my kids. I'm having a lot of stress outside of work, whatever it is. If you know they need support, giving them the information and saying, hey, I'm going to check in with you in a couple of days or a couple of hours or potentially in an hour if you're really concerned about them. Just linking them in with a professional and letting them know that we want to help them as best as possible. So there's a case study here. I've worked with an organisation that had two cohorts of leaders. Group one didn't want to say, are you okay? Because they were afraid that someone might say no and they didn't know how to handle it. And then the second group were taking on far too much. They were basically acting as the individuals or the team psychologists. And that might look like taking their phone calls at 2 a.m. on a Saturday night and going to pick them up from the city because the person had called and said, hey, I'm not doing well, I'm in crisis. That is not for your people leaders to do. And ultimately, it is outside of their scope and what they're trained to do. So the principles of psychological first aid will get those individuals with the right support networks around them and making sure that there is a healthy boundary between the people leader and the team member where possible. And ultimately, once this was implemented well, what we saw across both cohorts was no one was afraid to ask, are you okay anymore, which was fantastic. But importantly, everyone knew when to step back and pass those individuals onto the professionals. Ultimately, there was improved culture safety results, improved productivity, improved retention, and some really incredible stories of people who said the line manager, who is the most important person, it's been said, in relation to one's individual mental health, saved their life. And that's not an individual story. We had done time and time again. So whether it's psychological first aid, or if your organisation supports mental health first aid, there is a bit of discourse around what the right model is. But regardless, I congratulate you for investing in your people to give them the skill sets to have these conversations and create a really nice environment where people feel okay to speak up. So I said I'd talk a little more about culture surveys and maybe some adjustments that you should consider for your culture surveys so that you're assessing all elements of the job demands resources model, which was the 4 quadrants that I showed you, but it's actually down the bottom here as well in a different setup. If you follow the left-hand side of this model, sorry, I think I can do this, there we go. If the demands of the role are being met by the resources around the role, so you're actually being given the appropriate resources, technology, equipment, so on and so on, to meet the demands of the role, you're going to have an engaged workforce who's quite well, and you're going to get some really positive performance outcomes. If that's not the case, if the resources don't meet the demands, then you're leading to strain and burnout, definitely negative health outcomes, and also negative productivity and financial outcomes as well. So consider within your culture survey, are you asking about emotional demands, cognitive demands, time demands, physical demands, demands associated with organizational change? Obviously, there's a lot of restructuring going on, particularly in the technology sector at the moment. Consider, are you asking how people are managing that change. That's a really, really vital piece that often people feel they're not listened to or not spoken to about. It might be a national office decision, but ultimately no one's spoken to me on a shop floor about how this is impacting me. Really, really valuable to start asking questions to your frontline workers and your leaders about how they're feeling about organisational change. And just keep in mind, low scores could indicate a risk of burnout or psychological strain amongst your workforce, but I've made sure I put could in italics because it's really important for me to emphasise culture surveys aren't the answer on their own, right? It will build out a great piece of your story, but you need to consider your inspections, your incident reports, your claims, your HR conversations, and so on and so on. So a cheat sheet, this is where I'm going to encourage you to take out your phones and take a photo if you need to, because these are some really common recommendations that we're implementing at Psychosocial Solutions with the organisations that we're working with. So data-led decision-making is by far and away the biggest one. And often we rely on feel and we talk about culture without actually seeing any numbers behind it. Are you reporting on mental health outcomes or trends? And if not, why not? Or if there's a genuine reason why you don't feel comfortable to talk about some of the mental health outcomes in your organisation, it's really important that you're talking about them with leadership particularly. They need to have an understanding of the organisational decisions that are ultimately impacting operational staff and potentially leading to poor psychological outcomes. And this is, again, potentially a controversial one because mental health awareness training gets a really bad rep. But it's a really nice message for a new starter to actually see that my organisation talks about mental health. Again, it might start with a video of the CEO saying, hey, I just want you to know I go through tough times too. Yes, I'm in a senior leadership position. Yes, it can be stressful, and here's how I deal with it. Maybe I have a regular appointment with a psychologist. Maybe I make sure I'm eating and exercising well. Maybe I have someone who's external to my organisation who I'm really happy to talk to about what I'm going through, or maybe I used EAP myself, which is a really powerful one. If you've got senior leadership who are willing to go on record and say, hey, I used EAP and I got great value from it, it's a really, really valuable tool, and it emphasises the value that their team members can get from utilising EAP. A mental health oversight or steering committee that includes senior leadership is absolutely non-negotiable when it comes to building mental health strategy. Every code of practice, every website you see across New Zealand and Australia will mention that, but it's still something that we don't see often enough. So some organisations do it really well, and I'd encourage you to have an honest chat with your senior leadership about how they're talking about mental health in the organisation, and if they're not, you need to start to improve that conversation. That can be a beautiful start to introducing a strategy, is the CEO, the MD, a GM level, someone in a senior position talking to it, as opposed to it potentially coming from safety or coming from a HR, coming from operations or coming from senior leadership. It just brings such weight with it. And think about what you know to already be contributing to severe levels of stress, right? We all have these known knowns within our organisation that either team members complain about or don't like, or we see huge levels of turnover. You need to address them. Let's stop putting them in the corner in the too hard basket. We need to actually take them on and think about the controls that we can put in place to mitigate those severe levels of stress. And if you can have a consultation committee that, again, is including all levels of the organisation, that's super valuable, because often senior leadership will be totally surprised by what they're hearing from the operational staff on the ground. And then consider your incident review process, which is used to inform the prevention of future events. We do it really well with physical safety. We don't do it so well in Australia and New Zealand with psychological safety. So some key recommendations, again, continued. Feel free to take another photo. Business-wide wellbeing initiatives. So yoga gets a really bad rap and fruit bowls get a really bad rap, but there's value in it if you're getting a workforce who's really, really impressed by it and really engaged with it. Now, often that depends on the demographics of your industry. It often depends on the size of your organisation. Yoga class in a team of 20 is going to have a much greater participation rate than in an organisation of 100,000. So you just need to think about how you're implementing your wellbeing initiatives, and are they having the desired effect, and are they addressing your team members' needs? And then external partnerships. So really consider the Ministry of Health in New Zealand, Black Dog, Beyond Blue, at the regulators. Don't be afraid to call your WorkSafes of the world and SafeWork and say, hey, I'd love some advice. Ultimately, they have psychological safety teams now. You will be audited if you haven't already on psychosocial safety. And really, it's new for all of us in the countries that we work in. So just be mindful that it's okay to reach out and ask for help. In fact, I think you'll find it's really, really appreciated by regulators when they can see an organisation who wants genuine help and wants to be a leader in this space. Think about your EAP if you have it. Just make sure it's not a poster on a wall, and think about your leader education and support. And again, psychological first aid is something I'm really, really big on. I've seen the benefits across multiple organisations. It does it gives leaders that feeling of empowerment. It takes away the fear of asking, are you okay? And for me, more importantly, it takes away that ownership of what individuals might be going through, setting some really healthy boundaries that I'm a manager at work. Beyond that, I think you might need to see a GP or a psychologist. And empathetic human leadership. As I said to senior leaders on the call, don't be afraid to show a bit of yourself. And if I do an internal mental health training, I always start by saying, I'm a bit weird because I can't walk by a microwave that has numbers left on it. I have to press the clear button. And once you kind of take that, sting or boring safety conversation out of the room, I'm actually just talking human to human. I'm talking about, hey, these are the things that I'm a bit weird about. These are the things that upset me. These are the things that make me really happy. This is what's important to me and why I want to go home in the best possible way and really be in a great mood when I get home as well, because I want to be a good husband. I want to be a good dad. I want to be a good friend to those who need me. So it's really vital to kind of show a bit of yourself there as well. Some final tips from me. Once you understand your staff's commentary and you've considered the results of your risk assessments, act quickly, act effectively, and be really proud. Be public with what you're doing. Again, presenting it from a senior leadership point of view. Say, hey, really excited to say we're actually launching a new mental health strategy that we're calling Shine On. Or, you've got to have something that really links back to your values and your business kind of purpose. And once you do that, you'll start to have a recognizable brand. You'll be really, really public with it, and your staff will absolutely appreciate it. And just evolve. Like, it's so important. This can't be a document that sits in someone's drawer. And I always use the analogy, think about your COVID safe plans when you had them. They were up on the wall. Team members could access them at any point. They were living, breathing documents that changed with the regulations and the legislation, and they change daily. And sometimes in different jurisdictions, they changed hourly. We were able to show publicly what we're doing for individual safety. And if you can do that with your mental health strategy, I guarantee you your team will appreciate it, and you'll see improved markers across your people board. A massive thank you. I'm sorry, I know that was a lot of information.
Wow, Conor, that was absolutely outstanding. Thank you so much for that presentation. So much to take in. Let's just have a quick chat. Let's from Michelle, can you please advise your top 3 or more questions in a culture survey to source the correct data from the workforce?
Fantastic question. Off the top of my head, I probably can't tell you the specific wording, but I think that the key messages to look at, really consider emotional drain and cognitive space. That's what I'd be really focused on, because oftentimes we make assumptions based on the work that we're doing from a corporate setting. But if you're looking at all elements of even physical demands, then you're actually asking a rounded question when it comes to psych safety. I might just share my screen again and I'll go back to that slide, because I think that's going to give you the best possible understanding. And don't be afraid to say, are you comfortable with the amount of mental effort involved in your role? Now, that's a bit like asking someone, do you get paid enough money? Oftentimes you're going to get told no, and there might be a skew to the data. But again, this is where the culture survey is only one part of the bigger space. I'll bring that up, Craig, and hopefully that helps.
Sure.
There we go. So emotional, cognitive, time demands, physical demands associated with organisational change and caused by a lack of organisational justice. I might just call out, just in reference to that question, those last 2 might be organisational specific. So demands caused by a lack of organisational justice is, I don't feel I'm being treated as fairly as the person next to me. You need to be really comfortable that your managers are managing people who are underperforming, because your high performers are going to struggle with that. If they're not, if they're working 10 hours overtime and putting in all the effort, and the person beside me is actually leaving 20 minutes early after every shift and is really on their phone most of the time, that is organisational injustice, and that's something that's going to frustrate me. So be mindful of that. Consider if you're going through a significant change in your organisation, and ask them about it. Do you think we're handling this well? Is there something you think we could do better? Don't be afraid to be really transparent and open with your questions.
Cool, great answer. Next one's a really interesting one. How do you manage a worker who is abusing the system to avoid disciplinary action, i.e. claiming psychosocial factors as opposed to accepting responsibility for negligence resulting in the accident occurring? Assuming, of course, that the psychosocial factors were not involved and the incident was genuinely due to negligence, i.e. someone jumping on the bandwagon and using psychosocial as their crutch, as their fallback strategy.
That's an excellent question, and it's one I hear a lot, to be honest. So I think as the conversation has become more public and has really made it to mainstream media, I showed you some of the headlines that are showing up. That's daily news realistically now. So it is something that, we need to be mindful as the conversation is increasing for us as safety or HR professionals. It's also increasing for the general public. Now, we've seen this forever in workers' compensation. We will always have an element of either assuming people who are doing the wrong thing or people who are genuinely doing the wrong thing. And what I would say to you is, ultimately, we need to be mindful that the system is a lot harder than it used to be. If we look at what's happening in Victoria, for those from Vic on the call, and we've actually just changed the regulations as of the 1st of July coming up as to what will be accessible as a psychological claim. So where we sense that they're using it as a crutch, I think ultimately you need to trust in particularly your HR policies and procedures. If you have a robust consultation, if you have a really robust process that ensures that you're providing organisational justice and really fair opportunities for people to use the system, ultimately there are ends to that system as well. So what we deal with quite regularly is people who've been on a psychological claim for an extended period of time. Ultimately, you need to be working really closely with your insurance agent, your broker if you have one, and your return to work team as well to make sure that there's some tension on the claim if you believe that there's a lack of truth to it. I will asterisk that by saying, in my opinion, and again, it's controversial, if we take that conversation away, if we stop fighting claims, if we stop questioning the majority, we tend to get better outcomes in the long term because people are saying that the organisation is more focused on flourishing as opposed to remonstrating potentially with people who we believe are using it as a crutch. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you talk about how you think the relationship best works between the health and safety team and the HR team?
Absolutely, yeah. Another great question. Thank you, everyone. Look, ultimately, it just needs to be a regular conversation. I think oftentimes where we see gaps is HR might have received a complaint about bullying and harassment, and it was never looped in with the health and safety team, or really vitally, the injury management or injury and wellbeing or rehab team, return to work coordinator. They're a vital piece of someone getting back to work. Now, we know, and I won't go over it, if someone's off work as a result of a psychological illness or injury, it is so much harder to get them back to some form of normalcy in work. So ultimately, what we need to do is make sure the conversations between HR and health and safety are a regular occurrence and there is an escalation portal. So something I've used at a previous organisation is where a particular complaint was made, particularly around bullying, harassment or sexual harassment, there was automatically a committee that was called into practice. So it was the head of organisational psychology, it was the head of health and safety and the head of HR would get together on a call, and it was an immediate, we need to address this, how are we going to provide the best possible support, and how are we going to protect the person who's potentially been accused as well, because that's a really vital piece that often is missed. So yeah, that's my 2 cents on it, is have a really strong policy where you're making sure you're getting those really important key decision makers in the room together as soon as possible. But as well as that, a fortnightly meeting where you just want to talk about any incidents that have come through, really healthy way to do it. And then finally, if you can have systemic processes, so a notification system, if you're using an online health and safety portal like Eco Portal, making sure that there you go, there's a nice plug for you, Craig. Making sure the notifications are going to the right people. So it might well be that you have HR and health and safety on your notifications for certain criteria types. I really recommend that.
What are some of the tips you have about getting that buy-in, engagement from senior leadership team or even just from your direct manager to get on this journey?
Yeah, look, I have to say, I find no one is unaware of the importance of psychological safety now. I think over the last 3 years, and particularly any senior leaders who worked through the pandemic, they became really aware of this because their whole operating models changed. So it's on the agenda is what I would say to you. I wouldn't be concerned about raising this as something that we need to work towards. Ultimately, they're responsible, right? If we look at the health and safety legislation, they cannot be, as officers in the law, making inappropriate decisions that they knowingly are psychologically impacting people to an unsafe environment. So it's on the agenda for them is what I would say to you. I'd be really comfortable that, those individuals are willing and able and probably already have started the conversation. I think your job is to manage up and say, hey, ND, hey, CEO, hey, GM, or hey, my line manager, I'm going to get you at the front of this conversation, or I want you to facilitate this talk with Conor or with Beyond Blue or with Ministry of Health New Zealand. Let them be the face of the mental health strategy. Let them show a bit of themselves and you'll get much better buy-in.
Would you recommend creating a psychological first aid course internally or better to do it externally? And if it is external, any good recommendations to people you've worked with well in the past?
Look, I think ultimately that depends on your operational resources. So if you're in a large organization where you're lucky to have a skilled and organizational psychologist, for example, who's, really well trained, or even someone who's trained to be a psychological first aid trainer, yeah, absolutely, you can, utilize internal resources. The principles are not a secret. The principles are out there, as I said, from Red Cross and also from the World Health Organization. It's a really standard approach to managing people in crisis. And in terms of, if you don't have those resources and you want to go elsewhere, I would be remiss to not say contact me. But also, there's plenty of organisations out there. Just do your due diligence, is what I would say. I think in safety, there's a lot of organisations that jumped on the mental health first aid train, and ultimately, I think some people or some organisations have impacted the success of that program. Just be really mindful that you're going with a reputable organisation. People like St. John's are amazing. So, yeah, there's a lot out there.
Yeah, nice. And the same thing would apply to the question around psychological related incident investigation. Same places would provide same training for that new skill set, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Just on that one, Craig, I think really important to call out, don't be afraid of utilising safety skilled people there as well. And they know incident investigations, and they will bring a really strong lens to it. So whilst they might want support, it's a really, really great place for safety professionals to be involved in those incident investigations.
Thank you again, Conor, for a fantastic chat today. That was truly outstanding and insightful for everyone involved. So absolutely brilliant. For now, I would like to wish you all a good rest of the week. A final huge thank you to Conor. Everyone else, take care of yourselves and the people around you. Any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out for us. Thank you for listening to safetyCast. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and share with your colleagues, because safety knowledge is meant to be shared. Stay safe, stay engaged, and be sure to catch our next episode for more expert insights. See you then.